Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 11. Today we are going to be talking about a relatively new area of criminology, and that is criminology that's interested in studying development and crime throughout a person's life course. So people who do this research often have a history of training in things like child development, and using kind of alternative methods to studying criminal behavior because this is longitudinal, long-term research in this field. So we're going to start out today by talking about probably one of the most important studies in criminology that served as kind of a jumping off point for this field. And the seminal work that I'm talking about here was written back in the 1970s by somebody with quite possibly the best criminology name that you'll hear about in this class, a sociologist by the name of Marvin Wolfgang. So Marvin Wolfgang was a criminologist who worked his entire graduate school and career at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's famous for conducting one of the first longitudinal studies of criminal behavior over time. So you think back to what we know about kind of data in this field. Back in the 1970s, we were still primarily relying on things like the UCR and official statistics to study crime. Well, Wolfgang wanted to go beyond that. He wanted to study a small individual cohort, group of boys, and measure their criminal behavior throughout their experience growing up. So what he did was what has now become the Philadelphia Birth Cohort study. And essentially what happened is he gathered the names of about 10,000 boys who were born in Philadelphia in 1945, in the Philadelphia area. And so these are boys that were born in 1945, and he tallied over time the number of police contacts and the number of arrests each of these boys had over a time period of about 20 years. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to discover a few things with this. First of all, within a group, within a cohort, how many boys within any given birth cohort are committing crime? In other words, how many boys out of any given year that are born are going to be getting into trouble? That was one question that he wanted to know. He also wanted to know, are some boys bearing the brunt of most of the crime statistics for their cohort? In other words, are there, 10 or 15 really delinquent, really criminal boys out of every 100 that are responsible for the most amount of police contacts and arrests? Or does it seem like crime is more evenly distributed? That was the question that he wanted to know about. And what he was able to determine in his research was that over time, youths from this cohort were responsible for, a certain number of police contacts throughout their lives. But what he found interesting was a very small percentage of the cohort, only about 6% of the boys in the study, were responsible for over half, 52% of all juvenile contacts with the police within that time frame. So the observation that he made was that even though certain amounts of crime are recorded each year, it tends to be the case that a very small number of people are contributing a lot to those crime statistics. So this idea, Wolfgang's 6%, was something that really interested people. Can we actually find this small percentage of people who cause the most trouble? Because if we can find them, if we can identify them and either punish, arrest, or treat them, we should be able to have a pretty dramatic impact on crime statistics. If these boys are responsible for so much of our crime, couldn't we do something about this group? And the idea that came out of this research was a goal of trying to identify people that would fit into this 6%. And another word for that is that the people came up with at the time was trying to find people that they deemed career criminals. So the idea that came out of Wolfgang's research was the idea that there are some people who you can identify who would qualify as being career criminals, part of this 6% who commit the majority of the crime that goes on in their area. And this got defined at the time as chronic offenders, people who are committing crime all the time, and not only are they committing crime a lot, but they commit crime over a long period of time. It basically, committing crime becomes their career. So this is an idea that really took off in the 1970s and the 1980s. The idea that we should be interested in not just targeting and dealing with crime in general and just having general policies out there to prevent and deal with crime, but we should be targeting these chronic offenders. We should try to find them early in their offending. That's an idea that came out of it. So, as I said, Wolfgang's research was very influential at the time. This was a huge longitudinal study. It produced very convincing evidence that this 6%, these career criminals, exist. And what came out of this in the 1980s was a National Research Council panel that got held in 1986, where a lot of very prominent and famous scholars in this area got together and came up with a research agenda for the future, basically. And what they did at the panel is they wanted to assess the state of our knowledge about studying criminal careers. So, you think back to Wolfgang, that was 1972. We had a little over a decade of research that got done on this, and this was people's attempt to say, okay, given the past decade of work, what do we know? So what got discussed at the time was a differentiation between the idea of career criminals and criminal careers. And I want to make sure you understand the difference between those two concepts because they're very different things. So the first one, career criminals, was Wolfgang's 6%, right? It's the small group of chronic offenders responsible for the majority of crime over time. The people who, regardless of what age they are always going to be committing crime, and a lot of it. And basically, this was the group that Wolfgang identified, the group that he was interested in, and what we now call Wolfgang's 6%. Because the idea that came out of this wasn't that there are a lot of career criminals out there. This isn't a huge problem, but that small number of people create a lot of problems. But the other idea that had arisen in the 1980s and people became interested in was being interested in studying an individual's criminal career. So when you think about the phrase a person's criminal career, basically what that means is everybody, every kind of criminal, whether you're a chronic offender or you only commit crime for a short amount of time, everyone has some kind of a criminal career. What I mean by that is, and what researchers believed when they created these ideas, was that involvement in crime for every individual has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everybody has some kind of a career arc to them committing crime, even if it's a very short career, or it's a very long career, or there are stops and starts in it. There are criminal careers, periods of time where you're committing crime, that we should be interested in studying. So these are the two different kind of branches of research that came out in the 1980s. All of these kind of ideas are interested in studying a person's crime over time, right? It's the introduction of this idea that we should study with longitudinal data individual people to map their change. People hadn't done this before. And at the time, this was a very popular, very trendy idea to begin a research agenda about. So we've talked about career criminals a little bit, that small group of chronic offenders, and we'll get back to them in a little bit. But let's keep talking about this idea of a criminal career. Is it possible to actually identify and map out people's criminal careers? Can you map them out kind of like you could map out a career in law or medicine? There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. That was the idea that people became interested in. And because of that, this area of research in criminal careers, kind of developed its own terminology and its own language to address the relationship between a person's career and their offending. So let's talk about some of these new terms that came about in the 1980s that all of a sudden people became interested in studying. Again, nobody had ever thought about crime in this way. Most of the other theories of crime that we've learned about, if you think about it, they're all interested in explaining why someone starts committing crime, right? They all talk about social factors that lead a person into committing crime. Well, people who do criminal career research said, well, yes, that is important. We should understand why someone starts, but we should also understand why they keep going and why eventually they stop. You should be able to map out and understand the entire criminal career. So it was a new idea at the time to think about it this way. And they came up with some new language to address the relationship between age and time periods and criminal behavior. Because obviously, your age is going to have a big impact on this. What age you are at different parts of your criminal career is probably going to have a lot to do with the kind of offending and the amount and the intensity of offending that you're going to do. So the first thing that criminal career researchers believed was important to study was the idea of measuring participation. And this is probably not that surprising to you. Basically, whether or not individual people have ever offended in their life. How many people out of the entire population could actually report that they have committed crime, offended? That's one way to study crime, and that's the way that, if you think about it, a lot of research has been done. Have you, in the past year, in the past 6 months, committed a crime? Most people kind of stop with participation. Criminal career people said, no, we want to measure a whole lot of other things about a person's criminal behavior. We want to measure the prevalence of their offending, and that has to do with percentages. Okay, well, how many out of a group of people actually participate in criminal behavior? They also want to measure the frequency, the rate of activity, and this is something that became very important to criminal career research. It's one thing to say that 50 people out of a group of 300 have committed crime. It's a very different thing to say how much crime each of those people have done. A person that commits 25 crimes a month might be very different than a person who's committed one. And criminal career researchers wanted to be able to distinguish that. Frequent offenders versus non. And the seriousness of offenses was another thing that criminal career researchers believed was very important to study. Not only should we ask people if you've committed crime, but we should be able to distinguish between people who are committing rapes and robberies and murders from people who are committing larcenies and motor vehicle thefts. There should be differences there because the criminal careers of those kind of people might be very different. A person who is a rapist, who predominantly rapes as what in terms of his criminal behavior, might have a very different career arc than somebody who is a motor vehicle thief. And criminal career researchers wanted to study that. So, researchers in this area were interested in understanding all facets of a person's career, how it starts, how it occurs, and why it ends. And to do that, they came up with a few more terms to talk about in terms of measurement. So, of course, people who study the criminal career want to understand why it begins. Onset is something that they believed is very important. They also wanted to be able to explain how long somebody is a criminal, how long they commit crimes throughout their life course, the duration. And they also wanted to be able to explain why it might be that somebody might stop committing crime. And is that different depending on things like participation, prevalence, frequency, seriousness? If you're somebody who commits 20 crimes a month and all of a sudden you start desisting and stopping from committing crime, that's going to be a very different process from somebody who just kind of dabbles and commits 1 or 2 crimes every once in a while. And they wanted to be able to understand that. So many of the theories, again, that you've learned about so far in this class are interested in understanding why things like crime in adolescence is so high. I mean, if you think back to the past couple weeks, we've talked about subcultural theories explaining gang violence. We've talked about, youth, adolescent, boy delinquency. That seems to be a theme of some of the older theories of crime. Well, in the 1980s, people started to say, we should expand that. We should expand our interest outside of just adolescence. We should not only be able to explain why crime in adolescence is so high, but why it stops. What goes on in early and late adulthood that causes criminal behavior to decline? So they really wanted criminologists to expand their range of interest in the study of crime. They felt that studying crime and just looking at adolescence was very short-sighted of traditional research. So age plays a pretty big role in a discussion of there being some kind of predictable criminal careers out there. And the reason for that is that we still know from data about crime that the age crime curve exists. So if you think back to the beginning of class, and I'm showing it here again, a little bit squeezed, but the age crime curve nonetheless, we know that this pattern of offending, in terms of the peak ages of offending being about 18 to 20, we know that that exists. It's stable, it's not disputed. So if you're going to explain people's criminal careers, you should be able to account for that. Why is it that that peak happens at that time? And there are two different viewpoints about this, and they're very conflicting. And there's a traditional view and a criminal career view that got developed in the 1980s. And the conflict between the people who got behind both of these views became what we call now the age crime debate, which basically means that this debate divided the field of criminology in half almost. Some people believing in what we'll call a traditional view of why the age crime curve is out there, and some people who believed in the criminal career view about it. And the debate that went on throughout scholarly journals, right? People wrote articles, other people responded to them. There was a lot of disagreement and argument in the field about what role age actually plays in developing a person's criminal career. So let's talk about this traditional view first. The traditional view of why the age crime curve exists is a very simple one, and that is that each offender commits fewer crimes as they age. In other words, the reason for the age crime curve is that it is representative of all kinds of offenders. So almost everyone, basically everyone according to them, goes through this. They don't commit that much crime in early childhood, but starting in late adolescence and going up through early adulthood, up to about age 20, you really start committing a lot of crime. And then almost everyone stops when they get into their early 20s and really has almost completely desisted by adulthood, by their 30s and 40s. That's the traditional view. That should sound familiar because that's what some of the more traditional scholars that we've already learned about, people like Gottfredson and Hershey, would suggest. Then the criminal career people came in the 1980s and said, this might not be the case. It might not be the case that everyone follows this age crime curve. And it might have to do with how many offenders are actually out there and the rate at which they're offending. So in the criminal career view, the number of offenders, the number of people out there committing crime might be declining, but each one who continues is still probably doing it at a high rate. So in the criminal career researchers' view, not all criminals and not all criminal careers follow this aggregate trend. This age crime curve that you see on the left-hand side of the slide, this is an aggregate trend. This is taking all people, all types of crime, and averaging them out to show this curve. And what criminal career theorists say is that might be what everyone kind of smooths out and averages to, but people have different kinds of criminal careers. And the people who are going to keep offending up into later adulthood, they're going to be the minority. They're going to be that small percentage, but they're still going to be committing crime probably at a high rate. So the point here is that these two ideas, the traditional idea about why the age crime curve exists and the criminal career idea, sparked what we now call the age crime debate. People that felt very strongly in support of the traditional view started writing papers demonstrating that that was right. Criminal career researchers came back writing papers saying, no, we're right. And we'll talk about this on a little bit more in the next slide, but this was a debate that started in the mid-1980s about this relationship and is really still going on today. So in the next section, we're going to really break down each of the sides of this debate and explain to you, and I'll explain to you why this is so important, why this matters, because it's not just about people swapping papers back and forth. It's a much larger issue than that in the field.